Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 15th of July 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion.
This particular news, European Union India to meet on resuming FTA negotiations, appears on page number 11. Now, 7 years after talks on free trade agreement were suspended, India and the European Union are set to agree on a high-level dialogue on trade and investment to restart negotiations. Now, as you know that there is going to be European Union India Summit, which is being organized virtually. Indian side will be led by our Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi, who will engage with President of European Council as well as European Commission respectively. Before starting the discussion on what free trade agreements are, what are the advantages because of which two or more nations enter into such a treaty? With respect to India and European Union free trade agreement, what shall be the benefits accruing to each one of them, both politically as well as economically? And then finally, we will also cover the major areas of disagreement between these two partner nations, because of which the free trade agreement and negotiations have been stalled since past 10 years. Let us first cover what are the major issues which shall be discussed in this virtual meeting, so that you also have an idea about the kind of relationship which India shares with that of European Union. Now, obviously, no diplomatic engagement in the current times can go without a discussion on how to tackle COVID-19 and its impact on economy as well as the global order. A cause of concern across the world is medical developments on testing vaccines and treatment of the virus. Since both European Union as well as India are close partners to United States, withdrawal of US from multilateral organizations like WHO is a cause of concern for both of them, as well as increasing aggression and assertiveness of China in Asia is a cause of concern for both of them. So these are the major issues which shall be discussed. Now, during this summit, India and European Union are expected to conclude several agreements, including a roadmap for cooperation, an agreement on civil nuclear cooperation, launch of maritime security dialogue, and negotiations between Europol and CBI. And finally, the major focus of this dialogue is going to be about free trade agreement, and this discussion is about that. So this is a free trade agreement between India and European Union, officially known by the name of Bilateral Trade and Investment Dialogue. Before going into details of India-EU FTA, we should first understand what free trade agreements are. So free trade agreement is an agreement between two or more nations to establish a fair set of rules for trading, which are legally binding commitments. Once these countries enter into such an agreement, they promise each other to provide favorable treatment as far as import and export of goods and services within each other is concerned. A simple example of a free trade agreement could be reduction or even elimination of various kinds of trade barriers, and generally a sequence is followed while application and implementation of free trade agreements. Let us understand how. So they start by first cutting down the duties on import of goods from each other. Once they have achieved this reduction of import duties, they also work on easing out of non-tariff barriers like easing quantitative import restrictions, easing of customs procedures. So if you focus on these steps, you can clearly see that these steps would ease the exchange of goods. Once they have achieved this, they move on to ease restrictions on services, and they start by improving market access for service exports and better and more sound investment rules. Now, if you have not understood what these things mean, let us take an example of FTA between two nations, A and B. And let's see how FTA between A and B provides advantages to both of them as compared to a third country C, which does not have any free trade agreement with either A or B. So if A and B have an FTA among them, and let's consider a good one which has been covered under the tariff reduction regime of this FTA. So now you need to understand that when FTA is signed between two countries, not all goods and services get covered, but only some of them get covered. So any trade between A and B as far as product 1 is concerned shall be guided by the rules of FTA. So let's say that under the FTA, both countries have totally removed the tariff for product 1 for each other, which is 0%. But at the same time, for all other countries who do not have free trade agreement with that of A, this country levies an import duty of 20%. So now it is easy to visualize that any product under the category 1 being manufactured in country B is at a greater advantage as compared to the same product being manufactured in the country C, because then that will be at least 20% more expensive. So this is as far as the goods is concerned. But what about the services? Now, just like goods, all the countries also regulate their services sector, and they automatically do not allow the nationals of other countries to participate in their services. For example, have you ever seen a German or a French chartered accountant filing your return taxes or anyone else's return taxes in our country? No, because that is not allowed so far. So as the countries agree into free trade agreement with each other, they also allow each other's service professionals to practice in their territories. Now obviously the questions of as to how the standards will be followed, what shall be the education and qualifications to practice shall have to be figured out, and that is what is done in FTA. Now, if the two countries include service sector and increase the access for each other's professionals into each other's markets, then obviously the professional of the country C shall be at the great disadvantage because they cannot practice into A because they do not have access to the service sector of A or B since C has not yet signed the free trade agreement. So this was an illustration to make you understand that why two countries sign free trade agreement with each other. But there are other advantages which you should know from the perspective of mains examination as well. So if we talk about the advantages, the first and the foremost advantage is that FTA members gain benefit over non-members, as we have just understood in the illustration. Then the second important advantage of these free trade agreements is that they offer a great ease of negotiations. Because if you analyze all other kinds of trade agreements, for example, let's say WTO. Now, since the membership of WTO is so vast and the decisions are taken on consensus, it is very, very difficult to arrive at a particular decision. But in case of these free trade agreements, since the number of countries which are involved is very less, the negotiations on tariffs, goods, services and investment is relatively very easy to arrive, and hence they are a quicker way to increase the market size. Now, if you go back to the same examples, if a country A has not entered into any kind of free trade agreement with another country, then the size of economy is limited to just that of A, and similarly for B. But as soon as they enter into free trade agreement and allow access to each other goods and services, suddenly the market size for both of them increases, and that is a big advantage to both of them. Also, for a developing economy like India, signing of an FTA is a signal of openness to foreign investors, indicating that India is now open to not only foreign goods and services but also to ideas. Now, next 2 points are not directly related to economy, but politics as well as international relations. Often you have seen that the governments bring out certain reforms in economic sector, but then they are reversed by the succeeding governments. And that is a big problem because political parties often do not share the ideology. Now, one of the way in which a particular government can ensure that no reversal of policies takes place is by signing off free trade agreement, because once you have committed another country on opening up your own market to that country, it becomes very, very difficult to reverse that decision, and hence the reforms become unidirectional and generally they cannot be reversed. And that brings us to the last advantage, is that the signing of free trade agreement is, although in economic domain, it brings the two countries together and it strengthens the diplomatic relations also. So these are the major advantages of free trade agreements. Now, aspirants often get confused because of the various kinds of terms which are utilized to denote free trade agreements. For example, preferential trade agreement or PTA, free trade agreement or FTA, regional trade agreement or RTA, comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, comprehensive economic partnership agreement or CEPA, and finally broad-based trade and investment agreement BTIA. So while these terms written in the top row, preferential trade agreement, free trade agreement, and regional trade agreement are traditional and generally denote agreements which are limited to goods only. Whereas the terms written in the lower row, which is CECA, CEPA, and BTIA, are integrated packages covering a very wide spectrum of economy. For example, goods, services, agreements related to intellectual property rights, as well as investments. So next time, whenever you hear terms related to these agreements, try to differentiate whether India is trying to strike a PTA or CEPA or CCA. Also in the comment section, let us know that does India have any of the free trade agreements with other country in this particular category or not. So far we have covered the basics of FTA, the sequence of reforms which are brought about, how FTAs works with an illustration, the advantages of FTAs and the nomenclature. And now is the time to shift our focus to specifics of India and European Union free trade agreement. So since India and European Union are about to negotiate a free trade agreement, it becomes important to first understand that what are the benefits which each of them will derive. Now these benefits can be easily segregated into political benefits as well as economic benefit, of course, since it is a free trade agreement. So we'll start by first analyzing the political benefits to each of them individually. Now first let us start with European Union. In political terms, from the European Union's perspective, the free trade agreement with India will be its first with an emerging economy. And hence, it will support the EU's aim of employing free trade agreements to foster partner countries' integration into the world economy. At the same time, finalization of India's free trade agreement with European Union is going to give a strong signal to other such similarly situated economies across the world that European Union is actually a place where you can negotiate and find a place for yourself as well. And hence, it will strengthen European Union's role in global trade governance. If we talk about India, the free trade agreement with European Union is going to be a big boost to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Make in India campaign and his ambition to establish India as a regional leader and global manufacturing center. Also, post RCP, India has been seen as a country which creates roadblocks as far as openness or opening up of its own economy is concerned. By conducting these negotiations successfully, India is going to give the signal that the problem is not with India, but rather the kinds of terms and agreement RCP is going to bring about, and India had very rational and valid reasons to not go ahead with that agreement. Also, closer and deeper economic relationship with the European Union is also going to support India's rise as a regional power because of the boost India is going to get in its economy. Now let's move on to the economic benefits, and here we'll start with India first. A well-negotiated agreement will boost trade and investment flows between the two regions. If you don't know, European Union is India's largest trading partner and investor, as well as it is the main source of technology transfer to India. Now if we talk about the numbers, the value of European Union and India trade, it stands at more than $110 billion. So you can see how big the trade is despite the lack of FTA. Now also the fact that India lacks free trade agreement with any of its top trading partners, which are European Union, United States and China, shows the resilience of Indian economy. It is difficult to imagine the potential of Indian economy once the India strikes the deal with EU as well as the US, although the FTA with China looks very difficult in the current scenario. Now, if we talk about the economic benefits for European Union, of course, the preferential access to its products and services to a market of more than 1.3 billion people will give a big boost to European manufacturing and services. And also you should keep in mind the recent event of Brexit, where the Britain has broken away from European Union. European Union is actively looking forward to minimize the damages which will be caused due to removal of Britain. And India, with its large market, will not just compensate the loss of Britain, but will also add on to the economic activity of European Union. But since you have seen that the agreement is being negotiated since last 10 to 15 years, there must be a lot of hurdles, because of which the agreement is not being finalized. And hence, let us now discuss those. So if we talk about the disagreements between European Union and India because of these FTAs not being finalized, they can be segregated into disagreements related to goods, which basically means tariffs, disagreements related to FDI rules, most of which have been resolved by Indian government, then issues related to data security and level of protection in our country, then regulatory measures followed by both Indian as well as European Union agencies, then issues related to services sector, and then finally the model BIT, that is Model Bilateral Investment Treaty, which was proposed by India in 2016, which has already been discussed in the DNS. So starting with the goods, European Union and Indian expectations diverge a lot on issues such as tariffs which India imposes on cars, wines and dairy products imported from European Union. In fact, EU and India have even had trade disputes at WTO on wine and spirits and on pharmaceuticals. So just to give you an example, India currently levies import duty of around 60 to 100% on wines, which is obviously not good. Now, given that alcohol is a major source of revenue, it is not likely that India will agree to reduction in duties. If we talk about the cars or the automobile, the European Union has sought massive cuts in India's tariffs on automobiles and auto components being imported from Europe. Now, for example, fully assembled cars attract a 60% import duty, rising to 75% for cars worth above $40,000. But on the contrast, if you compare the European Union import duties on Indian cars, it is just around 6 to 7%. So this is one of the major issues. Apart from that, in the wake of COVID-19, the special emphasis given by the current government on Atmanirbhar Bharat and taking measures to ensure local manufacturing by resorting to protectionism also indicates that officials of European Union are going to raise the issues related to Atmanirbhar Bharat as well. Now, when FTA negotiations began, the FDI regime of India was very different. And India had a lot of restrictions on foreign direct investments in several sectors. And a special cause of concern for European Union was FDI in insurance, wholesale trade and single brand retail. Now, most of these issues have been addressed, but still it remains to be seen that how far it goes on to satisfy the officials of European Union. Then moving on to data security, one of the major roadblocks in this agreement. And the root cause of this issue is that India is not considered data secure territory under European Union legislation, despite India amending its IT Act 2000, which meet the standards of United States, but they actually fail to meet the standards of European Union. Now, as a result, the flow of sensitive data and critical information from Europe is hampered, and that means that Indian firms are unable to gain market access in European Union as far as data processing and storage is concerned. So this is a big issue. Now, both European Union as well as India have voiced concerns about restrictive measures that function as a barrier to their own exporters. For example, Indian government requires that 15 categories of IT and consumer electronic products must be registered in India or in our own country itself. A similar issue is mandatory in-country testing and certification of telecom network elements. European Union has problem with these kinds of rules. At the same time, it's not like European Union does not have similar rules. India has also been affected by European Union regulations and standards, especially on agricultural products. For example, imports of Indian mangoes were banned in 2014 after non-European fruit flies were found in some consignments. Although later on the ban was lifted, but nonetheless European Union keeps on applying phytosanitary measures on Indian exporters. And then finally moving on to the services sector issues. So first, let's talk about Indian demands. So India first demands the liberalization of visa regime of European Union. Now, objective behind Indian demand for reform is to allow skilled Indian professionals to temporarily reside and work in European Union and its member states. If rules on movement of professionals were liberalized, Indian businesses would benefit significantly from increased access to EU services market. But this is unlikely to be resolved because according to European Union, it is unable to intervene on the issue because these work permits and visas are under the domain of individual member states, and hence if you are negotiating a free trade agreement with European Union, these things will not be covered, and hence India will have to individually make an agreement with different countries. Also, a related issue is differentiated qualification and professional standards between European Union partners, which restrict Indian professionals' access to EU market. So for example, all the countries like Germany, France, Italy, they have different qualifications and standards for all the sectors. And European Union as a whole does not have a common qualification, and hence this is a big problem for Indian service providers, because once they qualify for one country, they have to appear for separate qualification and qualify for that for providing services into another country within EU itself. And as far as European Union demands are concerned, the European Union wants India to first liberalize its professional services sector, specifically accountancy and legal services. However, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and Bar Council of India are extremely opposed to such liberalization as they fear competition from overseas accounting and law firms. And finally, the India's model bilateral investment treaty. As you can see on the screen, the major issues with India's model BIT have already been discussed by me, and the link for the DNS shall be provided in the description of the video. You should go through that because this is the framework according to which India is going to negotiate all the investment treaties in the future, and there are some major issues with that, and hence those are applicable to the free trade agreement with European Union also. So this is it as far as free trade agreement and various aspects are concerned. Let's now move on to the next news. Next, we are going to take up a very important article, and there are two such articles appearing on newspaper today. One of them is Lost Opportunity on page number 6, which is editorial, and the next news appears on page number 11, which is India dropped for not involving actively in rail project, says Iran. Now both these news items are related to an event which happened day before yesterday, where Iran dropped India from Chabahar rail project. Now if you know, India and Iran had signed an agreement to construct a rail line from Chabahar to Zahedan along the border with Afghanistan. And now Iran has decided to go alone in this development of rail line, and Iran has cited delays from Indian side in funding as well as in starting the project. So in this regard, the editorial as well as the statement given by Iran appear in the newspaper today. Now before we go into that, if you have watched yesterday's DNS done by Mangal sir, he has already discussed the basics about Chabahar port, its strategic importance, the importance of Iran in India's worldview, as well as the causes of delay. And there is no need for me to do that again. And you can go to the DNS dated 14th of July 2020 to watch it in detail. What we are going to discuss right now is the three factors which actually justify the actions of Iran to go ahead with the construction alone and remove India as its partner. And if we summarize the points given in both the articles, it boils down to 3 points. And that is, the taking away of a railway project from India is just a beginning, because recently Iran has also entered into a big deal with China,
and that is the topic of next discussion. But the indications are that Iran is soon going to officially take away not just the rail project but also Chabahar port project from India as well. And that has been attributed to India's failure on 3 counts. Now the first is that India's failure to develop Chabahar port, which was very crucial for India's geostrategy, because first and foremost it provided our access to Afghanistan. Now if you know that Pakistan does not allows Indian access through land route, and hence the next best option available to access Afghanistan is through Chabahar port. And the rail line connected the port with that of Afghanistan, which we were not able to develop. And the Chabahar port is also at the very nascent stages of development. If completed within time and delivered by India, would have acted as our window into Central Asia. Because otherwise, our access to Central Asia would have required a long route. Apart from that, good relations with Iran is extremely crucial for our energy security. And finally, our dreams of countering Gwadar port, which is being developed by, or rather we should say it has already been developed very fast by China in Pakistan, has been shattered. Then, of course, India failed to develop Chabahar-Zahedan railway line. In fact, the work on this railway line has not yet started. Forget about the completion. And finally, India failed to counter US sanctions. And now it is surprising that although US gave exemptions to India's project at Chabahar, which meant that all those companies participating in the port development at Chabahar would not face any penalties, but then also India was not able to proceed with the development of Chabahar port, and it cancelled all the oil imports from Iran due to American pressures. On the other hand, China not only kept on investing in Iran but has entered into a deal worth $400 billion in return of cheap oil, which has given confidence to Iran that not only they will be able to complete these projects, but they will also expand their infrastructure as well as economy on the back of Chinese money, and which we'll discuss now.
Then next article on the similar topic but focusing on the crux of the issue is China making deep inroads into Iran appears on page number 14. Now this article is about a deal between Iran and China which right now is in advanced stages of finalization. And according to the details accessed by New York Times, this agreement would allow China to expand its presence in banking, telecommunication, ports, railways and several other sectors in Islamic Republic of Iran in return for heavily discount oil for next 25 years. So now the obvious question which arises is that what are the convergences between Iran and China? Or you can even rephrase it to say that why are the interests of Iran and China so much aligned that they are going to enter into such a big treaty? And those alignment or convergences can be segregated into 2 parts. Now first is geostrategic and of course economic. Now if you consider the geostrategy and if you analyze these 2 countries right now, both are at odds with USA. And you can say that both are among the top enemies of United States right now. While Iran's relation with United States has soured because of its nuclear program, the reasons for worsening Chinese relations are much diverse, ranging from economics to military and more recently because of the way China has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. Another aspect of geostrategy is the Iran's participation and active involvement in Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Now so far because of the strong sanctions being imposed by the USA, China was hesitant to take Iran on board actively. Now because of this deal, Iran's participation in Belt and Road Initiative is going to be much more than what was in the past so far. Now if we talk about the economy, their relationship is marked by complementarity. If you consider energy, Iran one of the most energy surplus countries. At the same time, China is the guzzler of energy and it is one of the world's largest energy user as well. So this is quite a good deal. Apart from that, if you consider the capital, now due to long-term sanctions of America and due to internal policies of the current government, Iran's economic activity is very dismal.
Whereas if you consider China, it has a lot of surplus capital as indicated by the agreement's amount ranging to $400 billion. So we can see that both in terms of energy as well as in terms of capital, they are marked by complementarity. What one has in excess, the other lacks. Then, as we have discussed, that both are currently facing economic sanctions imposed by America, because of which the Iranian economy has been shrinking. So on one hand, we talk about declining growth rates. For example, the case with India. But Iranian economy is shrinking. So if it was $100 in the year 2015, it has gone down to $80. And this trend is going to continue even in future, because recently International Monetary Fund has forecast that Iran's economy will contract by 6% this year. So if we combine all these factors together, this new agreement between China and Iran seems to be quite natural. And let's now look at what this 400 billion deal is all about by focusing on both China and Iran as to what each will get. Now, starting with China, in return of the $400 billion and multi-spectrum investment ranging from infrastructure to banking, will get heavily discounted oil for the next 25 years. Apart from that, we will see what it gets by looking at what it is going to invest in Iran. Starting with the Chinese capital, as we can see that the total amount is $400 billion, and due to American sanctions, not much foreign investment has flown into Iran. And hence this Chinese capital is going to kickstart Iranian economic activity. Apart from that, the investment is mainly going to be in the infrastructure sector. If we talk about the port, then obviously China is going to complete Chabahar, and also it is going to not only complete the railway project left incomplete by Indians, which is from Chabahar to Zahedan. But apart from this, Chinese companies are going to roll out the 5th generation telecommunication in Iran. Also, China has agreed to give Iranians access to their own GPS. Now, if you know the name of this GPS, please comment. Now just visualize, after 10 years, Chinese control majority of banking and investment sector. They have built and renovated the ports, and they have laid down the railway lines, and apart from that, all the new telecommunication which Iranians are running are on the 5G rollouts of Chinese government. As well, they are totally dependent on Chinese GPS for their navigation. Now can you easily imagine that apart from the cheap oil, what else China is going to get? And that is almost complete control over Iran and its functioning. A major contribution to increased influence of China in Iran is because of inability of Indians to complete their projects as well as to counter the American sanctions. And the price of that we have started to pay. The next article which we are going to take up appears on page number 10. ICMR caution on 2 drugs. One of them is itolizumab and another one is tocilizumab. Now these 2 particular chemicals are lab cloned antibodies, which basically means that they are proteins. And so far it was believed that they will work against the COVID by reducing the rush of cytokines. Because a lot of patients in our country have died because of a phenomena known by the name of cytokine storm. So first we'll start by understanding the cytokine storm and response, and then we will see what ICMR has to say about these 2 drugs. Now there is something which is known as cytokine response. Now cytokines are small proteins released by many different cells in the body, including those of immune system. Now they serve a very important function in the body, is that they coordinate the body's response against infection and trigger inflammation. Now inflammation is a very important immune response of the body because it prevents initial establishment of infection or removes the damaged tissues. It also prevents the spread of infection or repair the damaged tissues. And the cytokines or the proteins which are known by the name of cytokines play an important role in inducing these inflammation. Now so far so good. Now you know that this coronavirus or nCoV-19 is a novel virus, and most humans across the world do not have any immunity against this novel virus. And hence in some patients, The body's response to infection through cytokine response takes the form of cytokine storm. So, for example, when novel coronavirus enters into a person's lungs, it triggers an immune response, attracting immune cells to the region to attack the virus, resulting in localized inflammation. But in some patients, excessive or uncontrolled levels of cytokines are released, which then activate more immune cells, resulting in hyperinflammation. Now, this can seriously harm or even kill the patients. And now the studies are emerging that most patients who die of coronavirus are not dying because they are not able to fight the infection, but because a cytokine storm was triggered and their body went into overdrive to kill these viruses, resulting into hyperinflammation. Now, cytokine storms might explain why some people have a severe reaction to coronavirus while others only experience mild symptoms. They could also be the reason why younger people are less affected as their immune systems are less developed and so produce lower levels of inflammation driving cytokines. So now since you have understood cytokine response and storm, ICMR has yesterday stated that there is yet no evidence from trials of these two drugs that they are able to reduce the death rates in severe cases of COVID-19 patients. That is, they have not yet demonstrated mortality reduction by any trial. Now, the question arises that why these two particular drugs were even considered. Because these two have a history of use in immune system disorder diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis as well as acute psoriasis. And in both the cases, they have demonstrated that they are able to reduce the rush of the cytokine and hence they are able to prevent the cytokine response from turning into a storm. But so far, there is no study or trial which shows that they will be successful in case of COVID-19 as well. And hence, the need of the hour is scientific trials based on standard operating procedures.
The next article, Center Limits Duration of Online School Sessions, appears on page number 1. HRD Ministry has released guidelines for online education or Pragyata, which is an acronym for Plan, Review, Arrange, Guide. YAK means talk, assign, track and appreciate. Now the government has issued the guidelines is not so much important, but the rationale behind these guidelines and the data collected by National Sample Survey as a part of the survey on education will bring the harsh realities of our society in front of you, and we shall see how. First, let us discuss the guidelines. Now, according to the guidelines which have been issued by NCERT, schools can hold live online classes for a maximum of 1.5 hours per day from class 1 to 8, 3 hours per day for class 9 to 12th, and for kindergarten, nursery and preschool, the guidelines don't recommend any screen time for children. So basically, these guidelines, what they do is that they try to throttle the steps taken by various schools to run the classes as long as they were running the school time classes, which basically range from 6 to 8 hours. Now, if you talk about the rationale for these guidelines, you should understand the Indian society, and you know that members from different categories are present in the same class. Students live in households which fall into different categories. Some might have 4G, whereas others might not have. Some even don't have the smartphones. And there are also people who don't have any communication device at all, forget about 4G and smartphone. And hence, in that kind of scenario, it is going to put all those children who don't have access to these devices to a great disadvantage. And hence NCERT has come out with this decision to minimize this disadvantage faced by students or children belonging to certain strata of society. At the same time, it is also important to have a look at the data collected by National Sample Survey as a part of Survey on Education. And this data shall come handy in GS Paper 1, GS Paper 2, as well as in essay. Because only 27% of the households in India have some member with access to internet. Even those who have, which means the 27%, that does not necessarily mean that a household actually has internet at home.
Having access to internet and having internet access at home are two different things. So 27% of the households in India have access to internet, but how many of those have access to internet at home? Because during COVID lockdown, that is what is important. And if we talk about rural households, the internet access at home is dismally low at 23% in Kerala. And forget about Andhra Pradesh, where only 2% of the rural households have access to internet at home. Let us now increase the parameter and see how the households starkly reduce. Less than 50%, that is only 47% of those who have access to internet, own a computing device including a smartphone. Which again means that if they don't have any kind of device, how are the students going to access the online classes? And finally, to give you a data, Economist Intelligence Unit's Inclusive Internet Index 2020 ranked India at 46th position globally. But there is a solace in this fact also, and that is that India was the topper among South Asian countries. So you can now understand that policy making is so difficult. First, you have to make a decision on lockdown, then you have to consider various ramifications of lockdown, and then you have to solve those problems also. Although technology more often than not is an enabler, but also it can act as a disabler if people don't have access to those technologies. Let's now move on to the last discussion. This particular article, The Standoff in China's India Policy Dilemma, appears on page number 6 as the lead article. Now, this article has been written from the perspective of a debate going on in China. On the one hand, you have hardliners, and on the other hand, you have people who can be named as practical thinkers. And how they counter each other's argument has been discussed in this editorial in detail. So we'll first try to understand the views of the hardliners, and then we will understand the counter view and what are the advantages as well as disadvantages for both China and India in case if war breaks out between the two nations according to the counter view. So first we'll start with how hardliners view current border dispute in Galwan. Now, according to the hardliners, China-India relations does not hold great prospects in the current international scenario, as India is already considered as a quasi ally of United States with no scope for reversal. Now, as far as dealing with India, these Chinese hardliners suggest a policy of 3 no's. No weakness, no concession, and no defensive defense. Now, this strategy manifests itself in very aggressive China, which we are seeing right now. Because this allows China to take all opportunities to crack down on India, take the initiative to hit it hard whenever possible. And hence, as a result of this hardline view, we see continuous destabilization along the entire border region. It also includes creating tension from the McMahon line in the east to Aksai Chin area in the west. So we can say creating tensions east to west. And this policy also integrates weakening of India internally by supporting the cause of Maoists, Naga separatists and Kashmiris. But at the same time, just like any other country, there are other thinkers in China who do not support the above strategy and are critical about China's aggressive policies toward India. According to which, China's policy towards India has been that of a reactive in nature, and it has been characterized by tit-for-tat approach without any long-term clear strategic vision. According to them, India as a rising power is very important to China and will be increasingly crucial in the future, as China-India relations can become the most important pair of relationships after China-US links. They fear that if China-India ties are damaged beyond repair, then India alone or in association with other democratic alliance can cause endless trouble for China. Now, if you're following the newspaper, you must have understood this trend, which is of alliance formation. Recently, Australia has also broken its extradition treaty with that of Hong Kong, and they are increasingly converging along with Japan, US and India to form a stronger alliance against China. And some thinkers believe that it will be unwise for China to directly engage in a conflict with India, as India is a big country with significant military strength, and hence The advantages as well as disadvantages for both of these have been categorized in the table. For China, the advantage is that it has better equipments as well as logistical mobilization, and it also has advantage of positive psychology because of its recent gains in South China Sea as well as against India. Whereas if you talk about India, its advantages are it has a large practical war experience, it has the advantage of topography as well as climatic factors, it has developed its supply chain. In fact, this is the reason why the scuffle began on the first place. Whereas in case of India, the biggest disadvantage is that the capital, that is New Delhi NCR region, lies well within the bombing range of China. Whereas for China, the key disadvantage is that its borders with India are very scarcely populated and very far away from its main towns and cantonments, and hence it has to go through a long supply lines in order to be able to fight India. And hence authors on these sites believe that in order to teach India a lesson, China might lose more than what it gains. Therefore, if the conflict ends in a short period of time, it will benefit China. But if it is prolonged, China will be at disadvantage. Objectively speaking, this article is not so much important from the perspective of mains examination, but it is not always a good idea to be that objective. Let's now move on to the summary for prelims examination. From the perspective of prelims examination, there is not much in today's newspaper, but still you should try to recall PTA, FTA, RTA, CECA, CEPA, BTIA. There are questions to be solved from this section as well on our ELEARN platform. You should also remember that bilateral trade and investment dialogue is the name given to India-EU Free Trade Agreement. Also, you should recall the disagreements between India and EU on goods, data security, restrictive measures, services, and issues related to India's model BIT. Then significance of Chabahar port with respect to Afghanistan, Central Asia, energy security as well as countering Gwadar. The question of the day for yesterday, that is 14th of July 2020 was, consider the following statements regarding INS Vikramaditya. Statement 1, it is the only aircraft carrier in Indian Navy, which is correct. And the second statement is that it has been developed indigenously by Cochin Shipyard, which is absolutely incorrect because INS Vikramaditya is modified Kiev class aircraft carrier and the flagship of Indian Navy, which was built in USSR. And in the Russian Navy, it was named as Admiral Gorshkov. So the right answer is A, 1 only. The question of the day for today is, consider the following stages of trade integration between the two countries. Free Trade Agreement or FTA, Preferential Trade Agreement or PTA, Common Market, Customs Union and Economic Union. Which among the following correctly depicts the ascending order of trade integration?